As many of you know, the Israel-Palestine war is not the only war going on around the world right now. And of course, I'm talking about the Ukraine and Russia war that's been happening since 2022. Hasn't been much news coming out on that front. All we see is this stuff out from Israel. So it's hard to imagine that there's a whole war going on, but there is. And our guest today, Damon Boar, host of the History of Russia podcast, is, in my opinion, one of the biggest lights, at least that there is out there, on shining a good overview of Russia and getting some sort of knowledge on this country that is a very secretive place. People love to, especially in America, make their own opinions about it without any research. So today's episode is going to be all about finding out about Russia. Why are we in this war? Find out a little bit about some of the shady figures that are always popping up in Russian history. And from there, we'll get a little bit of the behind the scenes of one of the most interesting podcast guests we've had in a bit, and one of the better podcast hosts that I've seen. Damon has not done an interview before, so this will be the first time for him to get it out to the world how he sees things. And without any further ado, I hope you enjoy the show. Ask as the first question, the History of Russia podcast, and was this the first podcast that you ever decided to do? What's the reasoning for it?
No, well, the reasoning is I'm intrigued by Russia, and I have always found it. I've always loved history, so I combined the two. But my first foray into the podcasting world was with I lived in Sweden for a year. And I just loved the place. I just loved the vibe. This was back in 2008. And so I decided I was going to do a podcast, but then I thought, what am I going to do it on? And I hadn't twigged on the Russia or the history bit. And they always say, talk about what you know. But I decided to go off track. And I think I did about 26 episodes about various aspects of life in the Nordics. And I would say, looking back, and I haven't listened back to any of the episodes, but I would say if I did listen back to them, I'd probably cringe, because you don't
That's
have
the
a
way it always goes when you start.
that was us too, man.
Yeah, you don't have a recognized style. You feel a bit of an idiot. You're not sure whether anyone's listening. that's
right.
Luckily, a few people did, and then I decided that there really didn't seem to be much interest in what I was doing it was called Nordic World. And so I thought I'm gonna stick to something that I've always loved, that's history, and something that I find unique in the world is Russia, because it's neither one thing nor the other. Is it European? Well, sort of.
Right.
Is it more Asian? Well, again, sort of. Has its history followed the European model? Yeah, for some of the time. It's just its own thing. And
hey, just wanted to take a quick break from the show to say thank you so much for listening, if you wouldn't mind. And if you enjoyed the show, I would love for you to share it, rate it on Spotify, rate it on Apple Podcasts, and go give us a like over on YouTube, subscribe over there. It helps us a ton and gets the message out to way more people. And you guys have no idea how good you are at one little click, just how many more people get to see that show every single week. So do us a favor, share it up, and let's get back to the show.
And
right,
it's the largest country in the world, and it's, as we're seeing now, it's got a bit of muscle still, and it's flexing that muscle. So I got into this was about 5 years ago that I started, and I would say now it's much easier. I feel more assured, less self-confident, more self-confident in doing it. And I think the key thing to anyone out there who wants to do a podcast is just be yourself. Just go for it and be yourself.
Oh, definitely. I could not agree more. Now, when it comes to history of Russia, I do have some more pointed questions just because I listened to most of it. But I listened to every episode, actually. But when you started making it, I really liked how you were very upfront about the sources that you were using. And if I'm not mistaken, for the first, I want to say, I can't even number it, but somewhere around 10, 15 episodes, you're almost going off of one piece of historical data. Can you explain what that one source was?
I mean, I'm not sure if I can remember back that far. That was 3 years ago. But I do seem to remember purchasing at great cost. The Cambridge History of Russia was by Cambridge University Press. I don't know if that's the one you're talking about or whether it was a different one.
I think it was actually one of the original first-hand, I guess, recountants of antiquity Russia, but it's very heavily laden with stories, with obvious stretches of truth, and I found it enjoyable to see you try to use it as a. If I could remember the name, I would come up with it, but it was basically like you're following someone trying to heroically tell the tale of America, say, but it was Russia. And you have to parse through it. You have to go and say, okay, I know that they're exaggerating in this stance. I know that there's some truth behind this battle that they explained. And I found that fascinating.
A tweet, yeah. It was a particular. He was a monk, and he was based in a monastery outside of, they called it Kiev in those days. Kiev. No. What was it called? Sorry, guys, I'm not going to be able. It was some Nestor's Chronicle.
Yes,
that's what it was. Nestor's Chronicle, and Nestor wrote this chronicle several hundred years after the events that took place. So he was writing about when the Swedish Vikings, actually, or the Varangians as they were later called, were coming down out of Scandinavia and were establishing trade routes down through the rivers of what would come to be known as Kievan Rus, and ending up in the Black Sea and down to Constantinople. So this guy was picking on earlier stories and myths and sort of melding them or merging them into a story that made it look as if all of this had happened more or less by accident, and that the Russians or the Slavs had basically said to the Varangians, we need you to come in and look after us, or rule over us. This was in about the 880s. And he was basically building a myth, building a series of stories that Russia still looks back on as a sort of a foundation myth. So yeah, Nestor's Chronicle. I don't know how it came to me, but he was writing, I think, in the 1200s. So obviously yeah, and I remember now that I would sort of build into an episode that Nestor was, poring over certain manuscripts and sort of putting bits of paper together and to sort of coming up with what are established facts. The truth is, no one knows how the Vikings, the Swedish Vikings, managed to sort of, did they marry into the Slavic nobility? We don't know, but that's the myth, that's the story.
I got that. Paints such a good picture, though, and like I said, for those people that might be interested, the history of Russia, it explains all of this over so many episodes. I think we're at 74 now, coming on 75 soon.
75 will be out soon, yeah.
That's I love the show. Just being honest with you. So I did want to ask one more really specific question about the show before we kind of let it get completely loose here. But so far in your research, has there been one part of the time or one part of the history that has really sucked you in? And I mean, I know you're already interested in Russia, but really, like, you spent more time than maybe you should have.
Well, I'm actually spending more time than I should have at the moment, because one thing that's happened is that because as we move on, where I am in the podcast at the moment is around 1750. Okay.
Yep.
And there's just so much more to write about. A, because, there are more historical sources, but also at that time, Russia was, even though it was on the fringes, part of the European sort of league of kingdoms and emperors,
I will say, though, to your credit and to be totally fair to the position here, around 1700 is when the world starts speeding up. right? Like you have way more history happening every single year, starting around that 1650, 1700 time frame.
Yeah. So each episode is, and I'm conscious of this. I think there was one episode where I didn't even cover a year, and I thought, I'm going to be pretty old by the time I finish this, if I make it at all. So
I'll carry the torch for you, Damon. Don't even worry about it.
Well, I'll hand it over to you, Sam, if I need to. It'll be in time. But yeah, so I'm conscious of the fact, and I think it's in one of the later episodes where I say, look, I'm conscious of the fact that this is becoming a bit of a struggle. It's becoming a bit of a struggle for me. It must be for you. So let's speed things up a bit and crack on with the story, because somebody did actually write to me in the early days and say they love the pace, and that's important, especially if you're doing a historical long form podcast. Now, I've listened to many, and I'm just thinking, can we move it forward? What's the point to this? What I try and do is try and take the middle road between being detailed and truthful, obviously, and also trying to merge into that how we perhaps look upon those times today, which I'm not a big fan of, but sometimes you have to do it, I think, to give it perspective. Because they had their own rules back then, and they did things, they thought they were at the forefront of everything in those days. They were living in modern times, and we tend to look back and think, oh, they were the Dark Ages. Yeah, that's not how they saw them.
Right.
Sorry, you froze for a bit.
Yeah, I lost you for a sec, but you're back now. Okay. But I couldn't agree more. You have a modern way of looking at older societies, and really our historians, I would say, are pretty bad at almost always coming from like a looking down perspective, never really giving the people of the moment credit for being on the front lines of whatever they were doing in the day.
Exactly.
Like, you look at Peter the Great was one of my favorite examples, because when you look at it, he really kind of did deserve that the Great. Yeah, he had a lot of blemishes too on his record. So does everybody, especially in history, right? And then you try to compare him to someone today, and it does not work.
No, it absolutely doesn't. And I mean, you talk about Peter. I mean, that was enjoyable, particularly his trips through Europe.
Yes,
loved and that. when he arrived in London. I mean, if you read about it, it's almost like some kind of drunken frat tour,
Yeah,
it's a group of college lads on their sort of gap year. But Peter knew what he was doing, and he knew that he had to get some first-hand experience and pick up some skills. I mean, shipbuilding, for example.
It's one of the biggest moves. He learned so much.
Where am I going to go? Where am I going to go? I'm going to go to Holland, and I'm going to go to Great Britain, the two foremost naval powers in the world, and I'm going to learn, and I'm going to do it myself. That's pretty great.
Yeah, I could not agree more. So I do want to swerve away a little bit from the direct podcast soon, but I believe you've been touching on some of this on some of your extra content, which I want to start diving into at some point soon. I thought I noticed that you did an episode that was one of your paid episodes on Rasputin.
I've just started a mini series on Rasputin. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So how's that going? I don't want you to spoil it for me, because I'm going to go watch it, but how do you see the figure of Rasputin? Because he is one of my favorite historical figures of all time, just because of it not making sense.
Yeah, and you know what? Where to start? I draw heavily, and I thought you might be asking me about this, so I checked up this morning. So the source I draw really heavily on is a book just entitled Rasputin, and it's by a guy called Douglas Smith. And I've seen a couple of his videos on YouTube, and in the subject. So I'm just standing on his.
Gotcha.
I'm giving it tries to dispel a lot of those myths that everyone's heard.
Okay, so like the magical stuff, the magic healing power stuff,
the womanizer, and through careful research, I'll give you an example. So Rasputin came from this tiny village in Siberia. Was it? No, I can't remember the name of it now. But anyway, tiny village. And there were these rumours that him and his father were petty thieves. They stole horses. That Rasputin was a bit of a womanizer. There are no records for any of this. Okay, so from then on, everything you read that's come down to you about Rasputin, you start to question, and you start to think, well, hang on a minute. Now, I think where Douglas Smith's coming from is not that Rasputin was misunderstood, but that a lot of the rumours about him just aren't true. However, as I've started building the first part of the series, and I've just done the second episode, and I don't know how many there are going to be, and that's another thing I've learned. Never put a limit on how many episodes, because as soon as you do, you'll find it's wrong.
You're blowing through it.
Exactly.
Yep.
So, so I've looked at it and I thought, I don't know about that. I don't know. I think perhaps there could be some truth in that. So I'll give you a specific. So at some point, I think it was in 1897, Rasputin suddenly, the light goes on. The religious light goes on. And he starts seeing visions. And he starts wandering off. And before you know it, he's gone off to a monastery, about 1,500 miles away in the Ural Mountains. And he's seeking sort of some kind of salvation or message from God. Or did he just want to get away from the family for a bit and his wife, Because there is an aspect of that if you look at it, you think this is just too good to be true. Did that really happen? It may have done. I don't say he did or he didn't. I just imply that, well, there's perhaps another side to this. In conclusion, I can see why people paint him in such a dark way, because there are certain aspects of his story that are just too good to be true. Right. But anyway, go and listen. Show me your money.
Oh, I will. I will, baby. Don't even worry about it. That is well worth it to me. Yeah, I mean, Andrew, you got any sort of recollection about Rasputin? Because
I do.
I just love the story.
No, I actually had something for Damon though. So I'm not sure if you heard or you're familiar with, but an American journalist recently did an interview with Vladimir Putin. I wasn't sure if you heard about that or anything, but if you did see it, do you have any specific thoughts on Vladimir Putin's kind of rambling on the history of Russia? Because that was a good big chunk of that interview.
Yeah, I mean, somebody asked me about this the other day. Somebody at work actually said, we got talking, and I mentioned the podcast, and he actually gave it a listen over the weekend. Now, we've jumped from Rasputin to Putin. Okay, let's just make that clear. So, if you look at Putin when he first became, was it about 2000, I think, wasn't it, that he first became president of Russia?
I believe it was 2000.
Yeah. So this is
don't they have an election today?
It was either yesterday or today. I wonder who'll win.
Yeah. Gee.
Yeah. So he started off as a KGB officer, and he lived in East Germany. At peak Soviet Union. This is the 60s, or probably when the Soviet Union was beginning to decline a bit. He then gets to head up the security services under Boris Yeltsin.
Yep. And
then all of a sudden, Yeltsin promotes him or appoints him as prime minister. And if you look at early videos of Putin, you see someone who's really uncomfortable being interviewed. He looks self-conscious. He looks worried. He's not a natural by any accounts. He's a spy, effectively, and he's been the head of spies, and then suddenly he's the prime minister. Anyway, Yeltsin decides to retire, and he hands over the baton to Putin. And first few years, he seems to be reaching out. He seems to be taking control of things in Russia, getting rid of the what's the word for them? The rich guys who ran everything at the time. There's a specific word for them, but I can't remember what it was.
Are
Anyway,
you
basically,
looking about oligarchs?
oligarchs, that's the word, yeah.
No.
So Russia's in control, in the hands of these oligarchs, and Putin doesn't like it. He decides to take them on, and gradually, using various methods, he wins out. But at that time, he's actually part of the family of world leaders. He's trying to build relationships with people, particularly in Europe, but also in the US. And then all of a sudden, I don't know whether it's absolute power corrupts absolute, but gradually there's no opposition to him in Russia. And where I come from is that I try and find an equivalent situation, say with the US. And it's hard to do. It's hard to find a clear. But I guess the Cuban Missile Crisis was, back in the 60s was pretty close, where America was saying to Russia, you're interfering in our backyard here, and we're going to do something about it. Putin sees, and he's tired. I was watching something with him in it today where he said, how dare they lecture us? Why should we listen to them? And then he goes down the history route, and annoyingly, he's actually right in a couple of respects. So Ukraine, prior to the late 1990s, had never really been independent. Okay, it was an independent Soviet Socialist Republic under the Soviet Union. It was still part of the Soviet Union. I think it was independent for 2 or 3 years after the Russian Revolution. And so, the Russians' term for Ukraine, I've heard one of your podcasts where you refer to it as the borderlands. That's quite correct. Yeah. That's what its meaning is. But Russians used to refer to Ukraine as Little Russia. Belarus as White Russia. This has got something to do with the divides in the old Kievan Rus state.
Got it.
So, whilst I can give him some credence as to, his lessons from history, the methods of the man I can never agree with. Some of his, where he's gone after people, have been a couple of famous cases in the UK, where a guy was poisoned with polonium back in the early 2000s. And we sent some police over to Russia to try and find out who it was, and they just stalled. And in fact, they sent our police back with tapes that had nothing on them. They'd wiped them.
Really?
Yeah. And then there was the famous case in a town called Salisbury. I don't know if you've heard of the Salisbury poisoning, where an ex KGB officer and his daughter were poisoned with some kind of nerve agent. And actually, our security people worked out exactly how it had been done. And even Navalny actually managed to fool someone into taking a phone call from, and got the guy to admit that Putin's method. And yet, on the other hand, annoyingly, he's right, but he is an evil dictator, and he's not to be trusted. That's my take, anyway.
I like it though, but I appreciate the question, by the way, Andrew, because it leads. That question leads into kind of the next point, though, that I had to make, which was, given the situation that's going on with Russia and Ukraine at the moment, I can't help but assume that the news coverage or the media that comes out to you as a Brit is a little bit different than what we get to see as Americans. And I'm curious on what the outlook kind of looks like at this point from your perspective on the war that's still ongoing to this day. I believe we're coming in on 2 years now.
Yeah, we are.
Over 2
we've
years.
Just gone past. Yeah, it was February 22. So, to be perfectly honest with you, the war in Ukraine occupies very little news space at the moment.
Ours too. Ours, it's at almost minimum.
Yeah. And that's, naturally these things happen with the passing of time, but there's also been the Israeli-Palestinian
which has taken up most of the war talk.
Yeah. And also, we have an election this year as well. The fact is, we
Oh, you
don't know
do?
we don't know when ours will be, but it's probably going to be late autumn, similar time to your own.
Okay.
And so I can remember back to when the outbreak of war, and we were sending journalists over there, and we were promising this, and actually there was a scheme in this country where we were taking a small amount of Ukrainian refugees and housing them here with British families. Nothing
Yeah.
on nothing to the scale that neighbouring countries like Poland did,
Yep.
and other European countries. And I think the UK, like many other European countries, and probably the US as well, is just sort of sitting on the sidelines, just sort of not really wanting to get committed. We say nice things, but we
Right.
don't really back that up. And it's a very
Yep.
similar situation to my mind. There are probably some differences. But if you take the pre-Second World War period where Hitler was chancing his arm,
Yep.
by taking over parts of Czechoslovakia, as it was called then, annexing Austria, and we just stood back and did nothing, until it was
Yep.
too late.
Till you had to go all war, all in.
Exactly, and this is a lot of people say to me, "Oh, this is going to be a fascinating year." There's going to be an election in the US, and if Trump gets in, it's going to be World War III. I like history. I don't like to pretend to predict the future. Okay,
Right.
but if you look back at certain parallels in our recent history, I think at the moment I wouldn't say NATO is appeasing Putin, but we're doing very little.
Yeah.
Certainly,
That's almost
journalists.
appeasing, though, in my
It
opinion.
is, yeah.
You're essentially appeasing.
Yes, yeah. You are. You're saying nothing when bad men do evil. Something along those lines. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate your take, though, Damon, because I think that's pretty spot on in my opinion, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge in my opinion, the fact that NATO is not good for much except for that all-out war. Unless it's going to come down to all of us banding together to jump on the threat at once, it really doesn't give us much power to hold these bad leaders accountable.
No, and
It's true.
it's sort of. You'd have to look at the United Nations as well.
100%. I'm talking about those congruently when I say that.
Yes, yeah. You have to look at these organisations which act as a deterrent so far, and then if somebody decides to overstep the boundaries, like Hitler did in the late 30s,
Mhm.
and then we have the League of Nations, the forerunner to
Yep.
the United Nations set up, and
Yeah, that absolute failure.
they did absolutely nothing. So and that's a very good question because whilst this war has reached a kind of stalemate, although I do think Russia is going to win out in the end, unfortunately. That's what I think. It always seems to.
It seems like it.
Yeah, it's certainly got more resource to throw at it.
Yeah.
And if Ukraine doesn't get any money or any arms quickly, then it's going to be a long, sorry defeat. That's what I'm afraid of. I'm not going to predict that that's what will happen, but that's the outcome I see as happening. And whilst that's been going on, and Putin and China are, it seems to me, drawing closer together.
Are they?
I think they are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think they are. Yeah.
What makes you think that, Damon?
Just because of the number of meetings there have been with between Putin and Xi Jinping, the Chinese head of state, and also if you look at some of the basic facts around how much energy China needs and how much it gets from Russia. And
so were you saying? I apologize. Were you saying that Russia's getting closer to China?
Yeah, definitely.
I think I misheard you saying England was getting closer to China. That's my fault.
No.
Okay.
We have sometimes we do like China and sometimes we don't. Yeah, it's
same as us.
Yeah, and and so It's for two reasons, really. I think it's geopolitical reasons. I think it's let's combine and stand up to America. Sorry to say that, but that's what I see as happening. And also,
I agree.
They have a mutual interest in terms of trade and resources, particularly power, because as you know, Russia doesn't supply as much natural gas to Europe as it used to. A number of European countries, Germany in particular, were almost totally dependent on Russian natural gas.
Correct.
And so markets have to be found for that. And hasn't he also visited North Korea as well? Or didn't he have a summit with? Yeah.
Putin did, yeah.
So, worrying times, I think, worrying times, but we live in hope.
Absolutely. Do you, I guess living in hope just sparked this question in my mind. Do you live by any faith or religion?
I don't. The reason I don't is because my father, who's been dead many, many years, had an absolute hatred for anything organised. Okay, so
Okay.
when all of my mates had joined the Boy Scouts, I wasn't allowed to. Okay. This all he hated organisations telling you what to do, and that all came from the fact that he had to do 2 years national service in the 1950s or late 40s, early 50s, and he hated every minute of it. And so ours wasn't a religious house, and yet I am fascinated in religions, and I'm fascinated, particularly, I lived for a number of years in the Middle East. I lived in a small island off the coast of Saudi Arabia called Bahrain or Bahrain.
Okay.
Most people
How did
know.
you enjoy your time there? That's very interesting.
Absolutely fascinating. And I have been toying with doing something along, the history of the Middle East, but it's such a big scope that I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But
that literally goes back to human beginning.
Exactly. Oh, yeah. I don't know. But it's also because the Middle East is such a, what does the Middle East mean? What does it encompass? How many countries are in it? Whatever. But we lived there for 3 years. It was me, my wife, and just my son. My daughter was doing her exams in the UK, so we decided that she was going to stay on in the UK to finish her school. And when my wife and son came out, he was about 12, and my wife bought him an ice cream. And then she phoned me up in absolute panic, and she said, "Oh my God," she said, "Rob's just eaten an ice cream outside, and it's Ramadan." And I said, right, I said, first of all, don't worry, it doesn't apply to kids, okay? And even if you'd been doing it, it's highly unlikely anything would happen to you. But to live with another culture, and I went out there twice. I lived for 18 months in Dubai as well, which was less enjoyable. Dubai is more of a touristy kind of place.
Right.
A bit like Vegas on the Gulf,
Yeah.
And
Vegas.
when I worked in Bahrain, I was working with about 90% local Bahrainis. So I got an idea. And in fact, most of them, about the Sunni Shia thing with Islam? Yeah. So the vast majority of the world's Muslims are Sunni.
Correct. Yeah, it's like, what is it, 90-10, I think? I think it's about 90-10
I would say that's maybe 85-15, but
I've heard
in that
as well.
ballpark, yeah.
Yep.
But in Bahrain, you have a ruling class who are Sunni, and you have about 60 to 65% of the population who are Shia.
Oh, really?
And
I can imagine that stirs the pot.
It does. In fact, if you want to see, it's a video I absolutely loved, and it used to be on YouTube. I hope it still is. It's by Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera TV. It's called Bahrain Shouting from the Rooftops, and it's about the time of do you remember the Arab Spring when all these Arab countries were going to rise up? And so it's set in that time, but it's particularly interesting to me because I lived there and I know some of the landmarks. But it's about
Hmm.
that divide between ruling class and the majority of Shia Islam, who also, a lot of them have Iranian ancestors, because Bahrain used to belong to the UK or Great Britain. It was one of our so-called crucial states, halfway between, or a staging post between Great Britain and India, because remember, India was the jewel
Right.
in the crown of our empire.
Yeah.
And so we had all of these states in the Arabian Gulf that were acting as sort of protecting those sea lanes.
Right.
And interestingly enough, when I went to live out there, you could just exchange a British driving license for a local driving license. So those old colonial ties were still
Hmm.
there, however minimal.
Interesting.
Sorry, we're getting off the beaten track.
No, not really. This is fascinating to me. So, was it work that took you out to Bahrain?
Was it what? Sorry.
Was it work?
Yes, it was. Yeah, I used to
What do you
work
do for
for.
work?
I am a data migration project manager,
Oh,
and
fancy.
yeah, well, I haven't always been. I basically started off doing working in factories, shops, whatever. I didn't have a formal
Hmm?
college education or anything like that. And then I can remember I was made redundant from this factory. And in those days we had these things in the UK called job centres. I used to go
Okay.
down there and they would have jobs. This was pre-internet age,
Hmm?
and they would have jobs listed. And I saw this job that was paying around the kind of money I needed, and it was working night shift at a computer manufacturers, and I got into IT that way. I became a
Interesting.
computer operator, project manager, and at the time I worked in Bahrain, I was working for American Express, funny enough.
Oh, really? That's
Yeah,
interesting.
I worked for
Okay.
them in the UK, and then I went out to work for them in Bahrain, and then I went back to the UK, and the reason we came back was my son's education, and he was a young teenager, and there's very little out there for him to do in
Yeah,
terms of a real life.
I can imagine. So, given that you have a job that I can imagine is just probably at a desk or working quite a quite a stressful time, I can imagine that podcasting is kind of a getaway for that.
It is, as I was saying to you before we started, it's something that's mine. It's something that I can shape and move in any way. Well, within certain reasons. I mean, I could go
Right.
completely radical, but but
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do is tell people, give people my take on history, and hope that they enjoy it. Because a lot of people say to me, "Oh, history, oh, it's so boring, it's so dry," and
Not
I
these
I
two
agree.
guys.
No, but yeah, but I agree. Though I mean, sometimes you can pick up a book and it's so you kind of get the feeling that it's been written by one very clever person for an audience of other very clever people. Yeah,
Right.
and I
Exactly.
think there's a lot of that possibly goes on in academia. Where you have to
Hmm.
play the game by certain rules, and I don't have to do that. I mean,
Right.
do any of you guys listen to Dan Carlin at all?
Yes, I love Dan Carlin.
Yeah. So the thing I love about Dan Carlin is, I mean, apart from how the hell does he do those episodes that are like 5 hours long?
4, 5, 6 hours long. Wrath of the
Yeah,
Khans. I mean, that is some of
yeah,
my favorite stuff, man.
it is, and he's so, I mean, he's so enthusiastic. But he will often say, "I'm not a historian. I'm just an
No.
entertainer,"
Yep.
and that's I sit on that side of the fence. And yeah,
I appreciate it though. It's very appreciated, at least from someone like me.
yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad to hear it. And yeah, your question was, yeah, I sometimes find myself thinking, instead of um, instead of concentrating on work, my mind goes off on a tangent sometimes. I think, oh yeah, I've got to do that episode at the weekend, yeah, and I was like, oh yeah, I need to do this and I need to do that. I'd love to do it full time, but it wouldn't
Yeah.
pay the mortgage, so
No.
it will have to
Well,
remain. It will have to remain a hobby.
I I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing though. And maybe someday it will be your whole time because I hope it does. I think that you're not Dan Carlin because you're very much yourself, but there's a lot
Mm,
that I can tell that you take away from Dan Carlin that it makes it, like I said, it makes it easy for me to follow. And to be honest, like you were saying, history is dry, but when you have an interpreter like Dan Carlin, like yourself, right? It makes it so easy for an audience to get engaged and even want to go purchase some of those first-hand sources, second-hand sources that are boring. But because you got us into it, then it makes it more fun or more
That's all I'm
engageable or
trying to
something
do.
I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
all I'm
I
trying
think
to
you do
do.
a
And
great job.
I'm flattered you mentioned me in the same breath as Dan Carlin. The other guy who's influenced me a lot is Mike Duncan.
Mike Duncan is awesome. Revolutions and History of
Yeah,
Rome.
yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I guess that was pretty much the first one of the first podcasts I started listening to on
Really.
my old
That's a that's a
old
great show.
version iPod. You know, do you
I
remember the
actually just
iPods?
finished it.
Yeah.
Which iPod did you have? I
I
love
well,
I love
do
them.
you remember the old ones that they weren't connected to the internet at all, and you had to sync them up with a
Yep.
computer to download
Yeah, so you had to
episodes?
plug them in and you had to
Yeah,
have a whole
exactly. Yeah,
library on your
yeah,
computer and
exactly.
on your
Yeah,
iPod.
yeah,
Yep.
exactly. Yeah, how things have moved on. There is also a guy who, I guess he's a competitor of mine, or I'm a competitor of his. A
Hmm.
guy called, I think his name's Mark Strauss. He does the Russian Rulers History podcast. I
Okay.
don't know if you've seen that at all.
I have not seen that
He,
one yet.
it's also very good, and I
Hmm.
would say he is also himself. So
Oh, that's
although
awesome.
I'm probably cutting my own throat here, that's also one that I used to listen to quite a lot, and actually,
I don't think so. I will just say I think that promoting podcasting in general is a great thing. I think that anybody who thinks that they have an idea should do it. It makes you think and it makes you really try to stand your ground on positions and learn more because you feel dumb recording yourself.
yeah, you do, you do. It's I don't know. There's no getting away from it, and it never changes.
No.
I mean, I am slightly annoyed about one particular direction that the podcasting world seems to be going in, and that's
Mm,
it happens with everything. Okay, so
right.
something starts and it feels new and it feels fresh, and then these bigger groups sort of take it over. So you've got groups like
Yeah, and you have like sponsored podcasts that shouldn't
uh,
be at the top of the charts, but because everybody knows them or the group. Yeah.
exactly. And I mean, I view myself. I don't know what the equivalent in the US is, but do you know in the UK we have these small shops that stay open till quite late at night, and we call them corner shops. Okay, I
Yeah,
think in
yeah.
this,
So it would just be
Convenience
like a quick
stores.
mart or something like that, convenience
yeah,
store. Yep.
or yeah, that. So I see myself as a corner shop or a convenience store surrounded by these big Walmart type organizations
Right.
that get a couple of people famous and get them to talk about a particular subject, and everyone listens to it because they're famous. Having said
Yes.
that, some of them are pretty bloody good, I have to say.
They are.
They
A
really
lot of
are.
them are.
Yeah,
Yeah. It
yeah,
just so happens that they've flooded the market now, right?
they
So,
have. Yeah, they have.
I hope, we hope that this podcast hits a jet stream one day and we're on the likes of comparing to a Daily Wire or something like that. But odds are, because of the amount of money that they have coming in with investors and the amount of people that they're spinning off to make sure they don't lose social presence, the odds aren't great. However, we still love what we do. And to
They're,
be honest, our audience isn't that. Like, our audience isn't that little tiny section of the people that only thinks one way about a certain way of things. It's just not us.
I mean, sometimes at the end you'll hear them say, "This was a such and such podcast. It was edited by so and so, produced
Yep.
by somebody else. Somebody else did something else. Somebody else did
Hair
something
and
else." And I
makeup.
said, "Yeah, yeah." And I'm sitting there thinking, "Do it yourselves. Go on, give it a go. Do it yourselves. Do everything.
Right.
Do the artwork, do the writing up of the episode notes. Put everything together." But I guess that's capitalism for you. In the end, the big boys are
Yeah.
going to get a piece of any market, aren't they?
Ain't that for sure. I mean, on the topics of the history stuff, Andrew, did you have anything else? Because for the rest of our time, I was just going to banter back and forth a little bit, free talk with Damon a little bit.
Let's banter. Let's do it.
Okay. I want to hear. I know you told me a little bit about the show, but I want to hear more. How a Brit is seemingly more into American sports than his own beloved Man U and football out
I
there.
know. You see, you got that wrong, and you've committed the cardinal sin there. You've assumed I'm a Manchester United supporter, whereas it's the other team in Manchester that I support.
Good. Man City. Love
Yeah.
it.
Okay. Like I said, my grandmother had this distant relative who lived in Michigan that she would often talk about, and I really wasn't interested. And then I I started to get into American football or football. Let's just call it football. And like I say, with a few other
I feel bad.
idiots.
We got a Brit who we got to call the real football the real football. I feel terrible.
Yeah.
Do you know what? I was so obsessed with the Giants and American football that I started
Mm,
tuning in to American Armed Forces radio at like 2 o'clock
that's
in the
great.
morning to catch a game. The Monday 9 o'clock game. I would be
8:30, 9 o'clock
listening.
every Monday. Yep.
Yeah, I would be listening at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night, and the reception was awful. I mean, nowadays you can listen to any game you want to, wherever you are, watch any game, But
Exactly.
in those days, you couldn't. And occasionally the football wouldn't be on. There's a point in the year when the baseball and football seasons cross over,
Correct. Yep.
and occasionally I'd be listening to, I don't know, the Kansas City Chiefs and not the Chiefs, the Royals playing the Detroit Tigers, and I thought, hey, this is interesting. And when I started to read about it, baseball, it seems to me, is much richer in terms of its history and its folklore and its stats. I mean, how
Hmm.
many great films are there about America, to be honest?
There's about 5, and they're very recent.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen them, but I mean,
Actually, I will
There
caveat
are
that
good ones out there.
the best football movie I ever watched turned out to be an absolute scam, and that's The Blind Side.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
We heard about that recently. That
yeah,
only came out.
yeah. I'm not surprised it was a scam. I mean, isn't there
Me
one?
neither.
Isn't Al Pacino in one called Friday Night Lights or something? Is that one of the
Friday
ones
Night
that?
Lights is definitely a big one, and then you
Yeah,
have Remember the Titans is probably the most famous, I would say. Remember the Titans probably, and then you
yeah,
always have like The Longest Yard. That's like a good comedy football movie.
There's Rudy too.
yeah,
Rudy's a good one.
yeah. But I
Trying to
remember.
think.
But baseball, man, baseball goes back with the movies till movies begun.
Exactly. And I remember there used to be this specialist sports book shop in London, and I went down there once and I found this book by a guy called, I think his name was Roger Angel or Angle, and it was called Five Seasons, and it was about baseball between the years 1970 to 1974.
Okay.
Boy can this guy write. It is brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Mm.
He weaves stories about players and games and managers and some of the legends of the game, and that led on because baseball. We have this other sport over here called cricket.
Yes,
Yep.
very well acquainted
Yeah,
with cricket.
and cricket is very similar in terms of its history and its stats. So you'll be watching a
Interesting.
game of cricket. You'll be watching a game of cricket, and they'll say all of a sudden, and that is the 10th fastest century. Century is 100 runs, yeah. Scored at this ground. The ninth fastest was scored back in 1927, and it's just this history that holds the game together and makes it mean something. And yeah, I love UK sports, but I love baseball. I love American football. And in fact,
Mm.
my son likes American football. He doesn't follow a particular team, but he watches it. But I can't convince him on baseball, sadly.
Now,
He's just not there.
with baseball, I guess, and football at this point, but baseball keeps going over to the UK to keep playing games, I think, every year now for the past 5 years or so. Have you gotten to see any of those?
I haven't, no. I haven't been able to make it, and there's part of me that doesn't want to
Okay.
because again, it's that let's you can imagine whoever's running baseball and football these days is after, every sport is trying to dominate the world at the moment, and
Yes, they are.
I enjoy it enough already. I don't need to go and see. And also, some of the teams that they send over are not perhaps the elite in the league.
Yes, it's
I
true.
think the
Sometimes
Green
it's
Bay.
very random.
Yes, I think we get a lot of Carolina Panthers, Jacksonville Jaguar type games,
Yes.
and they know that people will turn up and watch them. So no, I didn't actually get across, but I would. I can't remember where they played baseball actually. I think it was at the London Stadium, which
Yeah, that sounds right.
yeah, it's at the London Stadium, which is where West Ham United, the English soccer team, play.
Okay.
Which it was originally the stadium for the Olympics, um, back in 2012.
Got it.
So yeah, but no, I don't like to play the corporate game. I like to stick out in for the independents, but I don't know. Maybe I should just take myself along.
I think that I'm just curious though. Have you seen a baseball game in person? Like a
No,
professional
no,
baseball
never.
game? I
No,
would
never.
highly recommend you do so. Only because you're a fan of the sport. I think it would
Mm,
really change your perspective of it. Even if it's like the reason that I'll say this is because Andrew and I both played baseball at a higher level, and Andrew actually higher than me. And the higher you go, it's just the better and the better and the better that these guys get. And I'll just say it doesn't matter which MLB team comes over to your guys' area, it's worth the watch. And it's
yeah.
probably worth the money. Especially if it's one game, it's very much worth it because you'll see something at a level that you didn't think was possible if you threw a ball outside your backyard with your son.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that these are elite sportsmen playing other elite sportsmen, so it's very difficult
Yep,
to see just how good they are. I take your point.
that is
Yeah,
true.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. But I don't know if you found it that I'm a friend of mine who's sadly no longer with us.
Mm.
Um, he was as a kid, he was on the books of uh, Tottenham Hotspur, or Spurs, as we call them, in
Mhm.
a football club in North London. And he said pretty much the same as you. He said he got to the age of 12, 13, and suddenly he's playing with other kids, and he said that you know they are just better than you. You can't
Yeah.
describe how or why, but they just are, you know.
Yep.
And my son, he played uh, soccer at school, and he said there are some guys you just can't get near them. You
Yep.
can't tackle them. They shield the ball so well. So I get exactly what you're saying. So who do
Yep.
who do you who do you guys play for?
I went to a very local college, played at that level, and then Andrew played at that same college and actually moved on. If you want to explain it, Andrew, it's a pretty fascinating story.
Yeah, so I started at the our local community college, played all throughout high school, and then I just transferred to a 4-year school
Right.
Halfway across the country.
halfway across the country. Yeah.
Yeah,
So when you
forgot
say
that
a
part.
four-year school, was that on a baseball scholarship or?
I should have known. So 4 year. So you guys have like traditional 4-year colleges over there too. Do you have 2-year colleges as well, like local community colleges?
Yeah, we do. Yeah,
Okay, so it's like
yeah.
the same kind of concept, right? You start do your 2 years, and then I did 3 years actually, and then I did another 2 years at the 4-year full school.
Right. And was it ever in your mind? You thought, do you know, I can make it big in this, or
When I was like 5,
When I
yeah.
was really young, or at least for me, when I was really young, that was the goal. And the older I got, the more I realized I wasn't very physically gifted, although I was gifted enough to make it to the level I did. The writing was on the wall. I should
that's a
probably think
shame.
about getting a real job. But Andrew,
'Cause
I can't speak for you, man.
Yeah, like I said, when I was like 5, yeah, that was of course the thought.
Mhm.
So, yeah, but I mean, statistically, I suppose it's difficult. But you guys do remind me of I think one of my favourite sports stories of all time, and there's two actually, and they both
Hmm.
involve baseball. There was one about, I think he was down in Florida, and he coached a local kids team, And he said that if you guys win the league this season, then I will try out for, one of the big league teams. And he knew it was a throwaway statement, but he was just doing it to get the kids to try their
Get
best.
fired up. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they won the league. And
Oh, wow.
this guy went ahead with his promise, and I think he tried out for it was Tampa Bay he tried out for. And they actually realised that this guy could throw the ball. He was a pitcher. He could throw the ball at 97. Yeah, and he just didn't know this. I mean, how can that happen in today's world where you have a guy who goes along basically because his kids have said, "No, we've won the league. You've got to go along." I mean, how did he not know he was that good in today's
That's
age?
incredible.
I love stories like that because, again, we all live in hope. And the other one I
Yeah.
was listening to the other day, which is a guy was doing some mathematical comparison between who hit 713 home runs. Was it Babe Ruth?
That was
Babe Ruth.
Babe
Yep.
Ruth lifetime home runs, and then a guy called Hank Aaron came along and beat it. Yeah.
correct.
And so, just as a joke, they looked at the various mathematical components of the numbers 713 and 714, and the rest of this video gets actually, and unless you're mathematically sort of or fascinated in mathematics, it's sort of lost on me a bit. He went along to a lecture with some other professors, and somebody invited him to a university somewhere else, and it was actually happened to be. He said, I went there, and it was pretty much tongue-in-cheek, but Hank Aaron was actually there at this particular seminar, and this guy hadn't known anything about it at all. So it seems to me that sport can still throw up these wonderful moments of innocence where it isn't about Moneyball or it isn't about a scouting system that has taken players to the nth degree and even then found out that they're not good enough. I love them both.
Yeah.
They're both on YouTube, by the way, I think.
I'll have to look into them. I love numbers, by the way, so that is one of the reasons I love baseball too. Just following it.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned maybe even before the show, or maybe even in the show as well. The statistics are so fascinating, and it's really all just numbers. Like if you get tired looking at two numbers, then you ain't gonna like baseball stats because it's just a sheet with abbreviations and good luck if you have no idea what they mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one I love is the fact that some guy back at the beginning of the 1900s managed the same team for 50 years. And it was the Philadelphia Athletics,
Yep.
And it did help that he was part owner of the team as well.
Yeah, he was the owner. You gotta love baseball. David, we're hitting about an hour now, so I don't feel any reason to hold you much longer. I'm sure you have quite a bit to do. I don't know if Andrew had any other questions for you, but
No, Damon, it was a pleasure speaking with you, man.
Really good. Yeah, I feel really good about the show we had today. I
do
think
too.
you really stood on. God.
Turn it into an episode because I wish I'd prepared a bit more, but part of me didn't want to. Part of
I'm
me
glad
just
that you
wanted
did.
to ad lib it, and
A lot of times it's better that way.
Yeah, I think so too. And I really enjoyed it, guys. And I shall carry on listening to your podcast. I'll give you a mention on mine.
Thank you.
So
That'd be great.
I think us corner shop podcasters have got to stick together.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more, Damon. I really appreciate this. Just, I'll probably stop the recording at some point in here, but I really appreciate you coming on and just reaching out. I mean, it made me love your show that much more. Just the fact that you're a real person, so that meant a ton to me. And yeah, I could not be telling any more the truth. I listen to every episode, and I really do enjoy your podcast, and I hope you continue it all the way to the end.
Yeah, and I love yours too. I'm a bit envious actually because I know that you guys can just it's more. I wouldn't say it's ad libbed. I'm sure you do some research into it, but it's more off the cuff, and it's
very much
a bit
in the moment.
it's a bit more natural. Before we sign off, who who's going to win your election?
Oh, that's a good question, Damon. All right. This is probably I'm not going to say this is a difference of opinion necessarily. I'm just going to take my honest guess is that I don't think, whether by natural or unnatural means, that Donald Trump has a chance in this election.
That's interesting
Andrew?
to hear.
I think Trump's going to win.
There you go.
I think Trump's going to win.
I would agree with you, Andrew. I'm sorry, Sal, but
Yeah.
the view on this side of the Atlantic is that, and I heard you talking about this on your podcast, and I know you've got more insights to me, but I don't know what the heck is wrong with Biden. Maybe he's just too old for this now.
He is definitely just too old. Going on a little bit of a not exactly factual tangent here, but I don't think anybody disagrees. He's not really running the show. He's got people that are doing all of the legwork for him. All he needs to do is show up for the cameras when they're on. And he's been looking just like him. He hasn't gotten any worse in front of the cameras, really. I think he's just not really doing much, to be honest. I think it's just the people under him that are doing the work.
Yeah, well, it worked for Ronnie Reagan.
Right.
He was the delegator par excellence. I mean, that guy knew exactly how to get the most of the people who worked for him. The thing I wish Biden wouldn't do is do that funny little jog run that he tries to do to make everyone think that he's more active than he actually is.
Running up to Air Force One.
Oh no! Don't just stop. Don't do that.
That's great.
It's a shame because the guy's got something about him. But I'll leave you with this thought that before long, I don't know how old Putin even is. What is he? Late 60s, early 70s? I think he's early 70s. Right?
I think he's early 70s by now. Yeah.
Yeah, and Trump, how old's Trump? He's in his 80s, isn't he?
He's getting close. He'll be 78, I think, by the end of the year, and 79 by election, maybe?
Yeah.
Or it might be 78 by election. One of those two.
Yeah, well, hopefully, and I don't mean them personally, any ill will at all, but they won't be around forever.
No.
And the trouble is, who's going to follow them? I don't know.
Who is going to follow it up?
Do you know we had?
And that's an honest discussion to have going forward.
Yeah, exactly. Who are the up and coming politicians? Because I don't see anybody in my country either who's got that. Who's got what it takes? I mean, it's interesting. I saw an interview. Do you remember we had a prime minister called Gordon Brown? He followed Tony Blair, and he was interviewed, and he's very impassioned about. He's a bit like a Bernie Sanders type character, yeah. And he said, "Oh, you think you can run for office again?" He said, "I find myself in the strange position of being too old to be a British politician and too young to be an American one." Yeah.
Oh, man. That's good.
Our prime ministers seem to get younger and younger. But anyway, I've loved being on. I know I've rambled a bit, but I'm pretty good at rambling.
I appreciate the rambling.
Yeah.
No, that's what we're about.
I hope you've got enough there to. I hope you've got enough good bits there to include in your show. If you haven't, don't worry about it. Like I say, I'll carry on listening, and it was just great to chat to you guys. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you so much, Damon. We'll be in contact then, and I can't wait for the next episode of the History of Russia.
Okay, well, I've got to start writing it yet. I must admit, I'm at the same time I'm doing the history of Rasputin, I'm also delving into the world of the famous Russian authors. So I'm writing one at the moment on a guy called Nikolai Gogol, who wrote a famous book called Dead Souls. The second one of Rasputin just came out. Actually, this weekend there'll be a new episode for you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because I have to leave it a week.
Now.
I have to leave it a week because I release it on the membership only side first, and then I leave it a week, and then I release it to the general public.
To the general pop.
Yeah.
Love it.
Okay. All the best, guys. See you later.
Have a good one, man.
I wish I were the fucking state. I wanna be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.